So our first stop is going to be to talk a little more in detail about this idea of RESTful routes, that in Rails we've just kept sort of pointing at this file called routes.rb, like what's going on there. And as a reminder, where are we in our big view from 10,000 feet? We have gone down from the app server down into the level of the models, views, and controllers. And we're going to be talking about routes, which are most closely associated with controllers. So that's going to be our first stop. And our second stop today, once we finish, is we're going to talk about the models in the database. So here are some things that you've seen before. What you've seen before is the stuff on the bottom. Here are the sort of standard 5 RESTful routes for any kind of a resource. As a reminder, the 4 basic things you do on a resource are you can create it, read it, update it, and delete it. And there's usually one additional RESTful action, which is give me back a list of all of the instances of that resource, possibly with some filtering. So routes like this you have seen before. We saw routes like this when we constructed them manually in apps like our Sinatra app. What's on top is the way that these routes would appear in the routes.rb file. So you can see that the syntax, and by the way, in terms of parentheses and things like that, how would I parse this? Because this is actually just plain Ruby code. This isn't like a special format or embedded language for this file. This is just plain Ruby. So how would I parse this? What kind of a thing is get in this case? Just like it was in Sinatra, right? Get is just a function, right? And because I have not parenthesized aggressively, if you can imagine, I wish I had a thing where I could draw on the screen. Does PowerPoint let you do that? What do I do? That's never going to work. There is no pencil. Oh. Is it one of these things? Oh, there, OK. Sorry, it's hard. It doesn't show up on my screen, so. OK, so let's see. I'm going to screw this up, but. All right, whatever. If you can imagine an opening left parentheses right after get, and the closing parentheses is going to be where? Where on that line would I expect to close paren? Not a trick question. All the way at the end. So get is a function that apparently in this case takes how many arguments? Really? Is it really 2? Is it really 3? Why isn't it 1? Let me rephrase that. It's 1. Why is it 1? What is the single argument that get seems to expect? It's a hash. It's a hash with 2 key value pairs. The first key is the string /movies, and its value is movies hash index. The second key is the symbol as, and the value of that key is the string movies. Okay? Again, our goal is to understand how routes generally work, but again, I want you to understand that this is just plain Ruby code. This is not like a special secret separate language or anything like that. Okay? So get, post, put, and delete are just Ruby functions that take a single argument, which is basically a hash describing what this route should map to. Right? So these are sort of the standard, by convention, if you look at zillions of Ruby apps, this is by and large how those apps choose to name their routes. They have controller actions called index, new, create, et cetera, et cetera. They have routes that look very much like this to map to those actions. And in a moment, I'll show you what the as is for. It lets you basically, it lets Ruby generate a function for you that will return the built version of that route. Let me pause for a moment and take some questions, because there clearly are some. This is subtle, so I want to make sure that people are comfortable with it. So great time to ask a question. All questions are good. No? OK, I'll take your word for it that you're still with me. So let's talk about a couple of things here that maybe look a little different from the RESTful routes we've been talking about so far. For example, we could probably agree that index and create are certainly part of the sort of standard RESTful routes, but new doesn't look like something we've seen before, nor does edit. So a question is, what are those actions doing in there? Why do we need a new action as well as a create action? And why do we need edit as well as update? They're sort of paired up that way, and they're paired up for a reason. And here's a hint. In terms of your API, if you were creating a movie, you would probably be doing a post, and you would include along with that post what? Just yell it out. A form. Some sort of data describing the thing that you want to have created. But if we're now talking about an app that might be facing a human being, where would that information most likely be coming from? From somebody filling out a form in a browser, right? So the create action is happy to accept a bunch of data saying, here's the thing to be created. But where did that data come from? In a human-facing app, it was probably entered by a human being somewhere. So you need a place where the human being can do that. And conventionally, that is an action called new, which serves a form that can be filled in. When the form is submitted, it will post to the create action, and the right thing will happen. Same thing with edit and update. You have an existing resource. You want to make changes to it. OK, but you need a way for a human being to specify what those changes are. By convention, the edit action will serve a form that shows what the values in the resource are now, allows changes to be made, and then when that form is submitted, it'll post to the update action. So that's why in a human-facing app, in addition to the default RESTful routes, you will typically see other routes like new or like edit, whose job is to serve the human being the current representation or a blank template that they can fill in. And then when they submit that, that's what triggers the action that causes the change to the resource on the server side. There was a question, sir.
Are these similar to like the anchor tags in an HTML page, which kind of redirect you to say a section called create or a section called show?
We will see how the anchor tags in HTML map to the views that do this, if you'll give me a little bit of time to get there. And there was, yes?
Is the reason that show and edit, or sorry, new and edit are get is because it's like the form and then?
Excellent question. So why is it that things like create and update, which make changes, use post and put, but things like new and edit are OK to use get? And I think your observation was exactly the right one. It's that new by itself doesn't actually change anything. It gives you a blank form to fill in. And if you submit the form, that would change it. Same thing with edit. Serving a representation of the resource that can be edited is not actually making any changes. It's just giving you the opportunity to submit the form and make changes. OK? Great. Yes, question?
What is the purpose of having the ID when you want to make a new movie?
Oh, it's a typo. Thank you for pointing that out. So the question was, in the route for making a new movie, why do I need an ID? And yeah, you're right. If it's a new movie, it doesn't have an ID. That's called a typo. I'll fix it in real time. And thanks to the magic of editing, nobody in TV land will ever know that we did this. Ta-da! Which is a good lead into the next question that I was going to ask, which is basically, how come some of those routes have an ID wildcard character in them and other routes do not? What determines if the route should or shouldn't have that ID wildcard someplace in it? $50 question follow-up if whoever asked the question about new, if you want to take a whack at this one.
Yeah, it's because like certain actions require like they're acting on a specific movie.
Yes, exactly. So basically, an action that refers to a specific existing resource, you need a place in the route to name that resource somehow, and that's what the ID is. But some actions, like create, do not refer to an existing resource because it hasn't been created yet. Same thing with editing. Editing has to refer to an existing movie to edit, and when you post or when you do the put to update it, you have to make sure to identify which thing you want to update. But on the other hand, an action like get movies, the very top one, because you're asking to see a listing of all of them, again, you're not referring to a specific one. Therefore, you do not need to identify it with a wildcard. Okay? Why is the wildcard ID instead of some other thing? Because that's a Rails convention. By convention in Rails, every resource has an ID, and it will appear in the default RESTful routes. That's how you're supposed to put it. In a moment, we will see what you get if you agree to that convention. Convention over configuration is always a bargain. If you agree to whatever your side of the bargain is, Rails gives you something in return. And in just a few minutes, I will show you what you get if you're willing to say, OK, I buy into this. This is how I'm going to make my default RESTful routes look for a Rails app, unless I have a really, really good reason to do otherwise. So what does it look like when we take a trip through a Rails app? Because we already saw a trip through a Sinatra app, right? The trip begins with Sinatra parsing the route and trying to match it to one of the routes in your app. The code runs, and at the end of the code, whatever the last thing that was executed in that function, that becomes the return value. We saw a simple case where you just return a string. We saw a more complicated case where you return an HTML page that has had some stuff interpolated into it. So what if we take that same journey, but a Rails app instead of Sinatra? What does that look like? So there's a couple of more steps. The first step still involves mapping the incoming route to some sort of an action. But in Rails, there's a separate piece of machinery that does just that. There's a whole separate file called routes.rb, and you specify at a pretty high level what you want those mappings to be. Why do you want a separate file just for that? Well, one example might be, if you remember again, going back to our RESTful APIs, one of the common use patterns for a resource is you want to do at least 4 things on it: create, read, update, delete. And maybe also index, where you list the instances of the resource, maybe with some filtering. That pattern is so common that in Rails, you can put a single line in the routes file that says, please set up routes for me for all of those actions with one line, as opposed to having one route that you spell out in for each case in your app. Just as with Sinatra, the controller action is the piece of code you write. And any optional parameters from the URI will be handled. They'll be extracted for you and put into a nice hash. It even has the same name. Just as in Sinatra, the code in the controller action will set up instance variables. And those instance variables can then be consumed by the views. So this is another example of that anti-orthodoxy of object orientation. Even though the views and the controllers are different classes, it is just convenient for the controller to be able to set variables that magically become available to the view. And that's what happens in Rails just as it does in Sinatra. The controller action eventually renders a view. This is a phrase that we'll sort of hear a lot. So I want to spend a few seconds on what does it mean to render a view. Basically what it means is, because we're doing request reply, every interaction that does not actually crash the app has to result in something. The thing that it results in might be an HTML page. It might be a JSON data structure. It might be a redirect, which was an example that we saw in Tuesday's lecture, where the response says, actually restart a new request and go to this other path, this other URI instead. But generically, we say that the controller renders something, and that's how you know the app is that interaction is finished. The view could be any one of different, it could be HTML, JSON, whatever. But rendering a view is generically what we say, OK, we're done. We're going to now present the result of what we did in some manner to send back to the client. So as an example, if we visited, we're going to have like a little fake app that we're going to create using Rails called Rotten Potatoes. It's like the Rotten Tomatoes movie app, but much simpler. We can imagine that when we try to visit a URI in our app, the first thing that happens is the routes file is consulted to see if there's a matching route. Hopefully there is a matching route. And again, do not worry about writing this down. I'm giving you a high-level tour. All of this is explained in much more detail in the upcoming homeworks. But one of the routes might say, if you see a route of the form get /movies/wildcard ID, that should map to the show function or the show action in the movies controller. Don't write this down. It is just an example. But I'm giving you a sense of what does the syntax look like for telling Rails how to do mappings from a route to the name of a function, a piece of code you write that is called when that route is submitted. If we look inside the controller, here's an example of what that route might look like, or the action for that route might look like. First of all, where do we go? In the controller subdirectory, we go to movies controller. How do we know it's movies controller? Because as we're going to show in just a moment, one of the key ideas that permeates the framework for Rails is called convention over configuration. What it means is if you agree to name certain things in certain ways, then it'll be automatic to know what controller file goes with what model file, which views go with which controller, which database tables are associated with which models. We do it just by looking at the words. So because in this case, we explicitly mapped a route to a particular controller action. But what we'll find is that in Rails, just knowing what's in the route, Rails will automatically infer the correct name of the file. Now, what does that mean for you? It means if you choose to give the file a different name, now you have to do extra work. right? Because now you have gone against Rails' opinion of, hey, if you're going to have a resource called movies, let's name everything associated with that resource after the word movies. The movie file or the model file for movies will be called movie.rb. The controller file will be movies controller. The views will live in a subdirectory called views/movies. The database table will be called movies. The things that help you make the view pretty will be called the movies helper. Like, everything is based on that word. That is Rails' opinion of the right way to do it. You can do it a different way, but as I said, most of those decisions were made because in the long run, your life will be easier if you can make it look that way. OK, so just like in Sinatra, we've got this nice hash that captures parameters that came from the URI. In this simple example, we're grabbing a parameter that we expect to be in the route called ID, and we're going to do something that, as we'll see, this is a database query. So this is the controller invoking the model saying, please call a method on the model that will look up information about this particular movie. Right? So this is sort of a peek into what a very simple controller action in a Rails app might look like. But notice here, here's the beginning of the controller action. Here's the end of the controller action. Where is the render? I just finished saying that every controller action has to end by rendering a view. It's got to somehow present the answer to the thing it computed. Right? In this case, the thing it computed is it got the details, presumably, for some specific movie. But where is the piece of code that says, OK, now package that up and render it somehow for the client to consume? Where is that piece of code? It is implicit. Because since the most common case in web apps that are model view controller is when you finish doing something, you're going to return an HTML page that somehow represents that thing. If you say nothing, by default, Rails will assume, well, let's see, the thing is a movie, and the action that you just did was called show. That's the name of the function. So I'm going to look in the views subdirectory under movies for a template whose name begins with show. And I'm going to use the extensions on that template to figure out how to actually translate the whole thing to raw format. Let me say that again, because there's a lot of automation here, but it is for your own good. The controller action, or the controller that we called is the movies controller. And within that controller, the action we did on the movie is show, which is one of the CRUD actions, right? Find details for an instance. Therefore, at the end of the show action, because you have said nothing to the contrary, because you have not given me other instructions, I, Rails, will look for a template named the same way as the controller and whose file name matches the action. If I find one, I will use the extension stripping them off one by one to figure out how to convert it to something. In this case, starting from the right, the extension is Haml. Haml is like a very, very concise markup language that takes a lot of the brackets out of HTML. So the first thing Rails will do is say, OK, I'll find a Haml translator. And the expectation is that once I run that Haml translator, what I'll get out of it is HTML. OK, well, that's cool, because I know how to return HTML. That's a thing I can return to a browser legitimately. So at that point, I will wrap up that whole thing in an HTTP response, and back it goes. OK? So this is yet another example of convention over configuration. We didn't have to give the name of the file. We didn't even have to say render the file, because those things are the defaults because they are such a common case. Happiness. Until you forget that that's how it works. Then sadness. OK, so convention over configuration, worth spending a few minutes on. Basically, if you're willing to adopt certain conventions, almost all of which are related to how you name things, then you never need to have separate code specifying what those mappings are. So as we showed in this example, if there's an action called show on a resource called movies, then the assumption made by Rails is that there is a class called movies controller, that class is defined in a file called moviescontroller.rb. Oh, good, this works. And that file should contain a Ruby function whose name matches the desired action. Right? So this is all without you actually having to set this up anywhere. Furthermore, by default, when that action finishes, Rails will look for a view called views/movies, matches the controller, /show, matches the name of the action, and as many suffixes as indicated, all the preprocessors necessary to run it until it gets to something that it knows how to return. HTML, JSON, XML, something like that. And by the way, within this template, I can have, just as with Sinatra, instance variables that were set up by the show method, and all those instance variables can be incorporated into the view. So that's the same machinery as we saw for Sinatra. It's just the decision of what to do and what files to look for has now all been automated. And again, you can override any of these things if you have a good reason, but if you're wanting to override them, that's a moment to ask yourself, if the designers of Rails through 5 major versions have converged on this as a good way to do things by default, what is special about my app that it doesn't fit this? Is it really that my app is not, I need to sort of go outside the framework, which sometimes happens? Or is it that the way that I'm thinking about the design of my app maybe is not quite right, and that if I thought about the design differently, I would come up with a simpler design that drops really nicely into what the framework already gives me? Okay, this is one of the most important things that you sort of acquire as a software engineer. It's called a sense of taste. Sometimes you do have to step outside the framework because you need to do something a little bit differently. You need to go a little bit beyond what the framework does. It would be ridiculous if the framework captured every possible Rails app that anybody could ever write. But if you find yourself doing it a lot, you should be asking yourself, maybe it's not you, maybe it's me. OK, so this says that the show action in the movies controller class, which is defined in the file moviescontroller.rb, renders the template view/movies/show.whatever.whatever. And this relies heavily on Ruby's ability to introspect and to do metaprogramming. So remember, if you've been following the sort of more advanced Ruby slides and videos that we did not have time to cover in lecture, Ruby knows how to ask any object a question about itself. For example, it can ask an object, to what class do you belong? And if the class name is movies controller, Ruby can do a little string manipulation to say, OK, if I take out the part before controller, lowercase it, now I can construct the file name, the directory name, and all the other stuff just from that. So a lot of this relies very heavily on Ruby's ability to introspect an object and use the object's name to derive all kinds of other assumptions about where related things in the app might live that have some connection to that object. Question, sir?
So is this implicit rendering to like use the equivalent in Sinatra of typing like that ERB?
Yes, so when I say that implicitly Ruby will render this particular view, that is the same as in our Sinatra app when we said herb and we gave a file name. We had to explicitly tell Sinatra, we want you to run the herb preprocessor, and here is the specific file to run it on. Rails basically makes those assumptions and does that thing by itself by default, unless we tell it to do otherwise. Right? So again, the downside is it's very opinionated. If you don't do things its way, you have to do extra work to go around it. Whereas in Sinatra, it has no opinion. So whatever it is you want done, you have to be explicit about it. It's a trade-off.